Getting started with Notation Switchblade Part 2. In this video we will cover configuration files, MIDI file preparation, and music XML conversion. If you want Notation Switchblade to automatically load the same configuration file each time you open it, you can save a file with your desired settings in your boot drive's root directory with the following name. When you launch Notation Switchblade, it will always look for this file. Let's create an autoload file by clicking on the Save button. The dialog that appears will always default to the name mid2xml-config.xml in your root directory, so simply clicking on the Save button will save this file in the right place. If you look at the various screens of Notation Switchblade, you can see that there aren't any settings on these pages yet. We need to save the settings that you want to use as defaults with Notation Switchblade. Click on the Load button and navigate to the Notation Switchblade folder. This is in your Applications folder on a Mac or Program Files folder on a PC. Open the Configuration Files folder. You will notice that there are configuration files with the word BASIC in their names. The other configuration files are specific to Audio Impressions libraries. For now, we will use one of the basic configuration files to familiarize you with Notation Switchblade. If you are using Pro Tools as a sequencer, choose the file config_9600ppq_basic.xml. If you are using Logic, Digital Performer, or Cubase as a sequencer, choose the file config_480ppq_basic.xml. Clicking on Open will load the configuration file. Click on the Tuplet Settings tab. You should see several tuplet settings. Each tuplet should have the PPQ resolution for the file that you selected. You should not have to do anything on this page unless you want to add any tuplets that are not already here. Click on the Beaming Settings tab. You should see beaming settings for several time signatures. You do not have to change anything on this page unless you would prefer different beaming patterns than the factory presets we provide. Click on the Track Settings tab. In the basic configuration files, there are a total of 32 tracks defined, all with generic names. If your MIDI file has less than 32 tracks, the Music XML score will only display the number of tracks that are actually in your MIDI file. Notation Switchblade can of course support as many MIDI tracks as you need, up to 4,096. If your MIDI file will have more than 32 tracks, you will need to add information for more tracks by using the buttons at the bottom of this screen. You can rename each track by double-clicking on its name. You can change the clef by selecting from the pop-up menu for each track. You can also adjust the line number on the staff that the clef will appear on. The tracks all default to using the G clef or treble clef. You will most likely want to adjust these settings differently for each MIDI file you work with, depending on the instruments you are using. Click on the Patch Settings tab. Patches are a feature of Notation Switchblade that allow you to convert MIDI CC, program change, velocity, or key switch notes into text or score symbols. Patches are covered in greater detail in the manual and in the Notation Switchblade in Action video. There are 3 patch groups included in the basic configuration files. The first group will draw dynamic markings on your score based on the velocity of your MIDI notes. The second group will draw dynamic markings on your score based on MIDI volume, which is CC number 7. The third group will draw slurs on notes that are played while your sustain pedal is used. The sustain pedal uses CC number 64. These use very common control methods, so we've included them since they can be useful in most MIDI sequences, regardless of what sounds you're using. You can always disable these by unchecking the Use Group box for the group you do not want to use. The dynamics using volume group defaults to being disabled. At this point, you can save the configuration file. You will be overwriting the file you saved earlier. To save as an autoload, click on the Save button, then navigate to your root directory. You can then save over the file you created earlier. Be sure to add the .xml extension to the name. From the dialog that appears, click on Replace. To make sure that the autoload file you saved works, quit Notation Switchblade and reopen it. You should now see the settings you just added every time you launch Notation Switchblade. In case you accidentally overwrite your autoload file, we recommend that you also save a backup copy of it. It is important to understand that a poorly prepared MIDI file will result in a poor Music XML output. If you recorded your MIDI sequence without referencing a click track or did not program in your time signature changes, you aren't going to get a good score output. The subject of using the various features of a MIDI sequencer program to correct this can be a lengthy discussion and is beyond the scope of this video. But the bottom line is, the location of bar lines, measures, and time signature changes need to be accurate before exporting a MIDI file. The following guidelines should be observed when preparing a MIDI file for export from your sequencer. You should merge all regions together for each track. Not doing this in some sequencers can cause each region to be seen as a separate track when opened in another program. You should also extend all regions to begin on bar 1, even if there aren't any notes until later in the sequence. Some sequencers automatically do this for you at export, while some don't. A region that starts later than bar 1 may be shifted to bar 1 during export, causing the notes you intended to play at a later point in your sequence to appear on the first measure of your score. Keep in mind that each MIDI track will appear as a separate staff in your score. Audio impressions libraries are designed to have all styles and articulations loaded on each track so that they can be converted to a score easily. If you are using other libraries, you may not have this luxury. In these cases, you might have several tracks, each with a different articulation, that are all meant for the same instrument. If you want the notes on these various tracks to appear on a single staff for that instrument, you will need to combine them into a single region before exporting. You should also avoid note overlap. Note overlap can cause several problems with your score. Tuplets will always need to be quantized. Notation Switchblade identifies tuplets by their quantization, so if they are not quantized, Notation Switchblade will not see them as tuplets. All notes that are not part of a tuplet, such as 8th notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, etc., should be quantized when possible. However, there is a certain amount of slop that can be left with these notes, as you'll see in the Notation Switchblade in action video. Make note of the shortest non-tuplet notes and/or rests in your MIDI file. This would be 16th notes, 32nd notes, etc. When we convert the MIDI file to Music XML, this will help us choose a setting in Notation Switchblade that can help eliminate unintended short rests that can occur on the score as a result of gaps between MIDI notes. When exporting the MIDI file from your sequencer, there may be additional settings you can choose. Always choose Type 1 MIDI file if the option is given to you. This will save the MIDI file in multi-track format. Now that you have exported your MIDI file, let's go back to Notation Switchblade and add the finishing touches to the configuration file. Make sure you have the configuration file we saved earlier open. You may also find it beneficial to leave your sequencer open so that you can quickly see what your tracks look like and decide what clefs and track names you want to use in Notation Switchblade. First, you will want to click on the Track Settings tab. Each track in your MIDI sequence will appear as a staff in the Music XML output. You can customize the clef information, track name, and even transpose up or down in octaves. If you work with the same MIDI template, you can save these settings as a custom configuration file so that the next time you use this MIDI template, you won't need to change anything in Notation Switchblade. We are almost ready to convert. Let's click on the Convert tab. Click on the Browse button for MIDI file to convert and find the file you just exported from your sequencer using the file browser that opens. Select the MIDI file and then click on Open. Notation Switchblade will automatically set an output file with the same name and location, but using the .xml extension since it will be converted to the music.xml format. You can rename the file if you would like. If you would like accidentals to appear on the score, clicking the Draw Accidentals button and selecting Favor Sharps or Favor Flats will draw accidentals in front of each relevant note on the score. This does not draw key signatures, it only draws accidentals in front of each note that is a sharp or flat. The last setting is the Quantize slider. This will reduce the PPQ resolution and cause all notes that are not part of a tuplet to snap to the setting you provide. You should set this slider based on the shortest notes in your sequence. If the shortest notes are 8th notes, set it to 2. For 16th notes, set it to 4. 32nd notes, set it to 8, and so on and so forth. Remember that this will not affect tuplets, so you can still have complicated tuplets in your score and this feature will not affect them. It will only affect 8th notes, 16th notes, etc. You can now convert your MIDI file. Clicking on the Convert button will render the output file in music.xml format. You can then open this in your notation program. You can now save this configuration file and reopen it with these settings at any time. Each time you make changes to your MIDI sequence, you can quickly convert your MIDI score into a music.xml score. Just remember that if you add or remove tracks, or change the order of the tracks in your MIDI sequence, that you will want to edit your track settings in Notation Switchblade to reflect these changes.